Okay, so what we need to finish today is a lecture on the Old South and free people of color specifically. So free people of color were black people in the South before the Civil War who weren't slaves. And they had gotten their freedom a variety of ways. Some of them were relatives of people who had been manumitted during that Revolutionary War era. Some of them had been slaves, but they had bought their freedom because their owners had allowed them to work on the side and save money and buy their freedom, or maybe their freedom had been bought by a loved one. There were 250,000 of them in the South on the eve of the Civil War. Now, what's interesting to me about them and to most historians is that they occupied a really vulnerable and precarious place between freedom and slavery. And they were perceived as a potential threat to the institution of slavery because obviously they contradicted this idea that black people couldn't live without white people taking care of them, that you needed black people to be slaves because they couldn't take care of themselves. And so, because they were a threat, they always had to be proving to white people that they wouldn't challenge the system. They had to be very careful that they didn't do things that would disrupt the Southern system. And there were laws in place to keep them in control and to keep them controlled, I should say. Things like if you moved out of a Southern state, often you couldn't move back, or you couldn't own a gun, and you had to appear in court on a regular basis with a white guardian who would vouch for you. Now, occasionally, free people of color owned slaves themselves. We don't see this a lot, but we did see it sometimes. Sometimes they were owning their own family members to keep them safe, but sometimes they were owning slaves just like white people would own slaves for business purposes to support themselves. And this came into public light not too recently, when Bill Cosby had the TV show A Different World about the black college students. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that show, but there was an episode where Whitley, the kind of rich, prissy college student, found out that her relatives had owned slaves. And it created this sort of crisis of conscience for her. And people in the media were kind of upset and wondering, why was Mr. Cosby doing this? And I think he was just trying to, say that this did happen. It was part of the history. Also, Jim Rourke, who wrote your textbook, one of his big books, was about a black planter in South Carolina who at his height had 63 slaves, I believe. And the records kind of indicated that he was a fairly typical planter, much like he behaved a lot like you would expect a white planter with 63 slaves to behave. But they were in this very vulnerable position. They didn't have, I would say, a lot of freedom to behave much differently. And they're kind of interesting to study, I think. All right, so that kind of concludes the Old South lecture, and now we're going to move on to the Movement West lecture. All right, now for this lecture, what we're looking at is movement into the Northwest with the Oregon Trail, and then we're going to look at movement into the Southwest, and specifically Mexico, Texas, and Mexico. And movement west was justified by the concept of manifest destiny. What is manifest destiny?
I believe those are preordained by God to
Yeah, it's this idea that God wanted at this time, white Protestant Americans to go all the way to the Pacific Ocean because they had the superior political, i.e. democracy, religious, Protestant Christianity, and economic capitalism systems in place, and that God wanted them to extend the benefits of those systems to everybody else. So it's this sense that you're supposed to do it this way. You use the word ordained, so that sort of suggests that it was meant to be and that God has God's hand in it. So it justifies what we might see as something bad, or we might see as expansionism that's taking over other people's ways of life, but they saw it as something that was positive because it was extending something that was superior to something that was inferior. Okay. Now, and it's really good for historians because, as you can see, Movement West caused people to leave a lot of diaries and letters, which is great for historians. Now, when people moved into the Northwest on the Oregon Trail, they were taking the typical covered wagon trip, which you guys, I think, know a little bit about. Many of you played a game called Oregon Trail. Yes? Grade school, high school, something? A couple of you? I'm getting a couple nods. It's a computer game, right? Yeah. Okay. So I know some of you know a little bit about the Oregon Trail from that. And I have a depiction of it here. Or sort of the area that we're talking about. The Oregon Trail is kind of, I think, really interesting to study. We're talking about the moving west in the 1830s or so. We're talking about family groups that go west. And the reason that they're going west has to do largely with economic motivation to leave. There were some economic depressions in the 1830s, so it might be people who found that they were out of options in the East, or they were seeing drops in prices for their labor or drops in prices for their crops. Maybe they were farmers in places like Missouri or Arkansas, and they were wanting to go further west. Or maybe they were laborers in New York City even who wanted to go west for a change of their lifestyle. And what the West offered them was supposedly this lush, that was fertile and lush. I got flush. Lush, fertile farmland that you could grow year-round, and you didn't have to worry about frost. And it was wide open for the taking. They weren't worried about Native Americans being there, so they were just going to go and take it. And they would meet in these jumping-off towns, is what they called them, along the Missouri River in the spring. And they wanted to go early enough in the spring that they could get there before winter set in, but not so early in the spring that they would have to be crossing these rivers, which they had to cross a lot of rivers when they were too swollen with water from snow melting. Because every time they had to cross a river, you guys, they had to unload their wagons and put everything on rafts and float it across a river. And that was really dangerous. If you can imagine what you would risk losing, including maybe your children who couldn't swim very well, or your livestock, and then get them over to the other side and repack your wagon on the other side and then go on. So it's very tedious and dangerous as well. Another major danger that you might associate with the westward trip was Indians. And the main Indian group that they tended to run across was the Sioux, S-I-O-U-X. And the Sioux were the ones they saw the most, partly because the Sioux had not been ravaged by diseases as much as other Native American tribes. Partly because the Sioux is that classic Native American on horseback. And because they moved around so much, they escaped the worst ravages of diseases. Now, I think the Sioux are really interesting because they would come actually to the wagon trains to trade. For a long time, we thought that the Sioux were more dangerous than they actually were. And the reason we thought that is because we were looking mostly at men's diaries who emphasized the bravery that it took to deal with the Sioux. When we started looking more at women's diaries, what we found was that the Sioux came more for trade and that the settlers killed more Sioux than the Sioux killed settlers. The Sioux were pretty well adapted at dealing with the Americans, and the Sioux even sued the American government for damages to their land. And the American government said, okay, fine, we'll give you some money as long as you stay off of the main thoroughfare that the settlers are using. And the Sioux took the money, and then they just went where they wanted to anyway. So they were pretty sophisticated about that. Now, what I find particularly interesting about the Overland Trail is the gender differences, which, like I said, historians have really just started to look at in recent years, because you can see a really different story emerging in a woman's life when she takes this journey than in a man's life. Here, I'll let you guys take turns reading this since my voice is going and it might be more fun. Can I have a volunteer to read this first diary? Okay, you want to come up and then I'll let you do the second one. This one is a woman remembering an accident that occurred to her when she was a child. So it's this paragraph starting, the children.
And then on the next, okay. Ends
yeah,
there?
exactly.
All right. The children had become so accustomed to getting in and out of the wagon as to lose all fear, and would go out onto the tongue and leap clear of the wheel without putting father to the trouble of stopping the team. On the afternoon of this day, the hem of my dress caught on an axle handle, precipitating me under the wheels, both of which passed over me, badly crushing the left leg before father could stop the oxen. Seeing me clear of the wheels, he picked me up and, carrying me in his arms, ran to stop the team, which had become unmanageable from fright. A glance at my limb dangling in the air as he ran revealed to him the extent of the injury I had received, and in a broken voice he exclaimed, "My dear child, your leg is broken all to pieces."
Thank you. Good job, Tara. Yeah, so you think about it. I mean, here is this, maybe a mom, and I think about it from the mom's perspective. Her child has just fallen under the wagon, and the leg is crushed. So, if that happened to me in my driveway today, I would be freaking out, but at least Scottish Rite is 20 minutes away, right? This woman is in the middle of, let's say, Nebraska territory. Does she go back to the east, or does she keep going? Or does the family divide up? And people made different decisions. Do they worry about infection setting in? Do they amputate? What are they going to do? It's very, very scary. And if you think about all of these, decisions that they had to make whenever accidents happened or snake bites or various things, you kind of realize the human side of this journey. All right, so this next one, if you want to do the next one, that would be great. This one has to do with the cholera epidemics, because cholera was a very terrible disease. People didn't have any immunity to it. And this woman is writing in her diary about how she's so scared about how everybody has cholera and she's afraid she's getting sick. So if you read from here down to here and include the dates, because that kind of gives you the sense.
May 11th, 1852. Our men are not any of them very well this morning. We passed another grave today, which was made this morning. The board stated that he died of cholera. He was from Indiana. We met several that had taken the back track for the state's homesick. May 12th. Our men not much better. May 13th. Henry has been no better today. May 14th. Just after we started this morning, we passed 4 men digging a grave. They were packers. The man that had died was taken sick yesterday noon and died last night. They called it cholera morbus. We passed 3 more graves this afternoon. May 16th. We have not traveled but 6 miles today, for Henry and myself are not able. May 18th. Passed by another newly grave made. If you could see our men now, you would hardly know if they were Negroes or white men. The wind has blown a perfect cloud of dust, covering us all with dirt. June 6. Traveled 14 miles today, had a sprinkle of rain about enough to lay the dust. Our deaf and dumb man died this morning a few rods from our camp. We found him lying by the side of the road without a person near that ever saw him before. We doctored him what we could, but he was too far gone.
Good, that's all. Thank you, that was nicely done. Good. So again, here you get the sense of the vulnerability that she feels and the risk, that people are dying and there's nothing that she can do and they feel sick, and what are they going to do if she starts to get cholera too? And then this last one, if I can have one more volunteer, this one is kind of about women, one woman in particular being upset that her husband decides he wants to go in the first place. One more. Do you want to go again since you're right here? Oh, do you want to come? It's this paragraph, in the winter of 18.
Just this one.
Yeah.
In the winter of 1846, our neighbor got hold of Fremont's History of California and began talking of moving to the new country, and brought the book to my husband's to read. And he was carried away with the idea too. I said, "Oh, let us not go." Our neighbors, some of them old men and women, with large families, but it made no difference. They must go. We sold our home, and what we could not take with us, and what we could not sell, we gave away. And on the 7th day of May, 1846, we joined the camp for California.
Perfect, thank you. So you really get this sense that the women don't want to go. It's the worst time in their life. They're going to probably be pregnant, and most women were pregnant or giving birth at some point. Amazingly, people got pregnant on the journey. But it's the best time in a man's life because you're young and you're ready to prove yourself, and there's all this opportunity. So the women don't want to go, and they lose. They have to go. And this is what one historian has said. I'll go ahead and read this one. I really like this language. One historian has compared men's and women's diaries of the Overland Trail and found that they perceived and wrote about the journey differently. Not only did women write of family and relationships, while men wrote of fighting, competition, and hunting, as you would predict, but women often shed new light on old subjects, like Native Americans, for example, having no special stake in asserting their bravery, having no special need to affirm their prowess. The women correct the historical record as they write of the daily exchanges by which the Indians were part of life on the road. Women considered the real enemies of the road to be disease and accident. So I kind of think that's cool. I like that. It makes it more real to me. All right, so that's kind of all we have time for with the Oregon Trail right now. But the next thing we need to talk about is the gold rush really briefly. And I'll say about the gold rush that it's, as you can see from the slide, a number of the people who went to find gold in California after it was discovered in 48 did use the Oregon Trail. But other people came other ways, and people flooded into California when gold was discovered there. And you can see from the numbers how California's population just exploded overnight. Most of the people who came were young men looking to make their fortunes. There were some women, and if you were a woman in California, you could get top dollar for domestic services or sexual services. In fact, we think that in 1850, 20% of female Californians were prostitutes. And if you wanted to get married, either having been a prostitute or not, you would find no shortage of men who would want to marry you because they were very much in, men really wanted to get married and find women there. So I think that's kind of an interesting area to study if you're looking for those dissertation topics. I was looking over your names on Go Solar because I want to work on everybody's names. And I know some of you have undeclared majors, so I'm going to work on you guys in particular. Watch out. All right, so now we need to look at people moving into the Southwest and specifically moving into Texas. Now, up until the mid and even into the late 1830s, we have to remember that as people are moving into Texas, this probably doesn't surprise us. We know that cotton is very profitable. We know that cotton also exhausts the soil, so you wear out your soil very quickly and you have to move further west. Unless you can really rotate your crops and let your land rest, you're going to have to move west and find new land. And so we had a lot of farmers moving west into Texas. These are white Southerners with slaves growing cotton. But when they move into Texas, they're basically leaving the United States and moving into Mexico. Mexico had recently gotten its independence from who? From Spain, exactly. Pull up the right map. Okay. And so they're basically living in Mexico, and it's not totally comfortable for these Americans there because, for one thing, it's a Catholic country, and these are Protestant people with a lot of prejudice against Catholics. Another issue for them is that Mexico has outlawed slavery. So they're breaking the law by having slaves. Now, most Mexican officials look the other way, but, it's not totally comfortable. Now, things are going to get really uncomfortable in 1834 when a man by the name of Santa Anna is going to overthrow the Mexican government and declare himself the dictator of Mexico. And he's the one who says, look, I am going to go and make these Americans in Texas heed. I'm going to make them understand that they're mine, that they're under my control. And I'm not going to get into the details of what happens, but I basically want you to know that he goes and he fights the Americans in Texas. And the Americans are led by a man named Sam Houston. Okay? And there are two battles. And at the first battle, the Americans lose. And that battle is at the Alamo. And at the second battle, the Americans win because Sam Houston says what to his men? Remember the Alamo. Exactly, you guys heard that line before? Remember the Alamo. All right? So at that point, at gunpoint, Houston says to Santa Anna, it's 1836 now, you will recognize Texas's independence or we'll kill you. And Santa Anna says, okay, don't kill me. And at that point, Texas becomes independent. In other words, it's not part of Mexico, but remember, it's not part of the United States yet. It's the Lone Star Republic. It's by itself. Now, Sam Houston is an old buddy of Jackson's. Remember, we're still with President Jackson. And he fully expects that Jackson is going to pull Texas into the United States. But Jackson doesn't do it. And in fact, no president does it for the next 10 years. In fact, there are a number of white farmers in Texas who are kind of annoyed by that. But why do you think the presidents don't want to do it? They keep putting off that hot potato. Maybe the next guy will want to do it. Maybe the next guy will deal with it. Why don't they do it?
Does it have to do with slavery?
It does have to do with slavery. What about slavery?
Maybe because like they already had like a slave, Missouri Compromise issue, the slave states, and so like three sentences might disturb the balance.
It's going to upset the balance, right? And not just a little bit. I mean, remember what a big problem Missouri was. And Missouri was kind of a smallish state. It was kind of on the northern side. This is a big mother of a state, right? It's huge. And it's got a lot of slaves. So these presidents for about 10 years are going to put off Texas because they don't want to deal with how big it is, how many slaves it is. I mean, think about the 3/5, even just the 3/5 compromise. You're going to have a lot of representatives in Congress from Texas because of all the slaves that could be there, right? So it's a big issue, and the president's put it off for 10 years until finally, about 46, we're going to get to a president, Polk, P-O-L-K, who is going to deal with it. And Polk is going to deal with it because he wants to bring in not only Texas, but a lot more territory too. And he's going to do that by picking a war with Mexico. Now, how does he pick this war with Mexico? Well, he takes advantage of the fact that the United States and Mexico disagree about the southern boundary of Texas. I'm not going to get technical, but basically the United States says the southern boundary of Texas is here. It's one river, which would make Texas bigger and Mexico smaller. And Mexico says, no, the southern boundary of Texas is this river, making Texas smaller and Mexico bigger. And so Polk sends his general Zachary Taylor into the disputed territory and waits for Mexico to attack. And guess what Mexico does? It attacks, exactly, which is just what Polk wants, because then Polk can go to Congress and say, we've been attacked on American soil, so we have to defend ourselves. Polk's war message is, quote, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood on American soil. So guess what? America goes to war with Mexico. It lasts a little over a year. It costs $97 million and 13,000 American casualties. So that's pretty significant. And the Americans win, and they bring a vast amount of territory into the United States. Basically, a lot of the West, all of what we think of as California and the southern green area and Texas comes into the U.S. And of course, now slavery and the West is going to become a huge political issue. And there are some smart men on both the pro and anti-slavery sides who are going to see that this is going to be a huge problem, really, for the U.S. Ralph Waldo Emerson, you guys know him from your English classes, transcendentalist, northern, anti-slave abolitionist guy, really. He said, the United States will conquer Mexico, but it will be as the man who swallows the arsenic which brings him down in turn. Mexico will poison us. And John C. Calhoun, you know, who was John C. Calhoun? You need to know this for the test. Who was John C. Calhoun? He was from South Carolina. He was Jackson's vice president. He articulated what? Starts with an N. Nullification. So a very pro-Southern, pro-slavery kind of person, very different from Emerson, but he had a very similar prophecy. He said, Mexico is the forbidden fruit The penalty of eating it would be to subject our institutions to political death. So they both see that taking in all this territory is going to be too much for American politics to handle. All right, so this kind of leads us now into my next lecture, which is sort of the events leading up to the Civil War, my House Divided lecture. This, by the way, is, the territory that's going to be gained from Mexico. This is a depiction of Manifest Destiny. All right, the first serious suggestion of how to deal with this territory came from a Pennsylvania congressman whose name is David Wilmot. And his idea became known as the Wilmot Proviso. The Wilmot Proviso said, I know, let's just say no slavery in the territory gained from Mexico. Of course, it didn't pass because white Southerners would not go along with that. The fact that he would even suggest it was alarming to them. But I want you guys to understand that it was the first major suggestion, and I want you to understand that he represented free soil men. And free soil men were men like David Wilmot from places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, who wanted the West to be opened up and to look like their farmland, with white farmers settling the West without any people of color. So I want you to understand how you could be free soil, anti-slavery, but not abolitionist. These guys are not reading Frederick Douglass or Linda Brandt. They aren't concerned about slavery because of the moral issues. In fact, they don't want black people out there because they're basically racist. That's one of the reasons that they don't want any slavery out there, is they don't want any black people out there as their neighbors. Another reason they don't want any slavery out there is they don't want to have to compete with farmers who have slaves, because they don't have slaves. And a third reason, probably the most important, is that they don't want to look over to their next door neighbor and see that he's having slaves do the work that they're doing, because that degrades their work. I'm putting work into my farm. I feel proud of my work. I feel good about what I'm doing, toiling my land, my sweat and my labor, feeding my family. And then I look over and enslaved people are doing the same thing. Somehow it cheapens this work that I feel proud of and that I feel is noble and good. So these are some of the reasons that these men are anti-slavery. And I want you to understand who these free soil men are. And I want you to see how they are anti-slavery, but they're not abolitionist. The kind of things that you're seeing probably in your Linda Brandt or your Frederick Douglass that are supposed to pull on people's heartstrings or pull on their Christian values or pull on their moral values, that is not what is motivating a lot of this economic and ideological free soil movement. Do you guys see that? Do you guys see the difference? Okay.
Wait, you said they're from the middle states? From like Pennsylvania?
They're from places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. I mean, if you look at the map, right through here. Okay. Now, the Wilmot Proviso doesn't work, but what does work, the compromise that is reached about how to deal with all this new territory, is known as the Compromise of 1850. And don't try and write all this down because there's too much on this slide. I'm going to walk you through the Compromise of 1850. And I do want you to know the Compromise of 1850. You should be able to put the 5 components on a map for the test. Who's our great American compromiser? Henry Clay. So he's quite old at this point, and he comes out of basically retirement. I think he was, 73. I guess he wasn't really retired yet, but he was quite close. And he came up with the Compromise of 1850. This is a 5-part compromise, and it's important to know that each part had to be pushed through separately. 79% of congressmen voted against some part. So it tells you how divided people were. So what were the 5 parts? Number 1, California was admitted as a free state. So even some pro-slavery people might go along with that, sort of acknowledge that California's topography and what you could grow there doesn't lend itself to cash crop agriculture and therefore slavery. Number 2, Utah and New Mexico would be admitted with territorial status. What that means is you go ahead and let those 2 areas come in as territories, and you put off the sticky issue of statehood when you have to deal with, are we free states or are we slave states? And when it is time for them to come in as states, we'll use the concept of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty means we're going to let people vote when the time comes. And they can vote whether they want to be a free state or a slave state. You guys got that? All right, the 3rd part was supposed to be the least controversial, but it turned out to be the most controversial. And that was the Fugitive Slave Act. That was putting the money and the power of the federal government behind tracking down runaway slaves. It said the federal government was now going to use its money and your tax dollars to find runaway slaves. And if, let's say, I'm a deputy in Boston and I've tracked this runaway and he's gone into this warehouse, let's say, Daryl, you're walking to work. I don't know anything about you, your politics, your values, but I can stop you and deputize you to help me find this runaway. And you might not like that, but I can do it. So there was a lot of resistance and anger about the Fugitive Slave Act in the North. People hated it. It's part of the reason Linda Brent devotes a whole chapter to it in her book. And it's the reason that Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote in 1852, what book? Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Uncle Tom's Cabin was a very powerful novel. In fact, so powerful, a powerful novel about slavery that galvanized support for fighting slavery. It was so powerful that supposedly when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said to her, "Oh, so this is the little lady who started the Civil War." And she wrote it because she hated the Fugitive Slave Act. All right, so that's number 3. The 4th part, and this was to give something to abolitionists, was abolishing the slave trade in Washington, D.C. So if you're someone who opposes buying and selling human beings, you would really hate that it was happening in our nation's capital, and you wouldn't want it to go on there. And then the 5th part, number 5, is establishing the boundary between New Mexico and Texas, because that had been in dispute, the boundary between New Mexico and Texas. So those were the 5 components. They're, like I said, very difficult to get those through. Almost 80% of congressmen voted against one part of it. You do need to know what those 5 were, and you need to be able to put them on the map. So some of you might need to look up Washington, D.C. Make sure you can get that on the map. So what do we know from this? Well, We know our country's really divided by 1850, but did the compromise work? Well, we kind of know where the story's going, so you guys are shaking your heads no. If you're living in 1850, you probably thought it did work because you thought, okay, we fixed it. We're okay now. Or maybe not. Maybe you would be someone who would think, this isn't a done deal. One thing that might make you think the latter would be that the party system was really breaking down. It was becoming really hard for, are you guys okay? You have a question? Number 2, that was admitting New Mexico and Utah with territorial status. And then when they came in, they would use popular sovereignty. Let the people vote. All right, so what's happening in 1850 is that the party system is breaking down. The Whigs in the South and the North can't really agree on a platform or a candidate, and neither can the Democrats. The economic and the ideological issues that used to unite the Whigs is breaking down. What's the big issue that people are really either united or divided about now? Slavery. Exactly. So it's really breaking down over slavery. All right, so that was 1850. Now think about our stair steps to the war, kind of like we did with the Revolutionary War. This is 1850. 1852 was the publication of what? Uncle Tom's Cabin. I mentioned that. And then the next big event is 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So let me tell you about the Kansas-Nebraska Act now. Really wishing I had my marker. All right, the Kansas-Nebraska, I'm going to leave this map up for now. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was when it began, when Stephen Douglas, who was another one of those free soil men, remember you still have in your head the free soil men I described? Yeah. But he was a free soil man from Chicago, or he represented free soil men from Chicago and places near Illinois and Indiana. So he's from here. He's the senator from Illinois. And he wanted to open up the West for free soil men in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. And one way to open up this area for these kinds of guys would be to have a railroad with Chicago as the eastern terminus. So it would be a railroad that would go this way. But if he's going to have this railroad that's basically more in the north than in the south and have federal support, he's going to need to get the Southerners to go along with that. And to get the Southerners to go along with it, he's going to have to give them something. So he gives them the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which basically gives them Kansas in 1854. He says, let's take this territory right here. And if I had my marker, what I would do is I would draw a line right here next to Missouri at the top of, basically at the top of Missouri. And we'll draw a line straight across, and we'll divide this territory into 2. And the bottom part will be Kansas, and the top part will be Nebraska. And we'll have 2 new states. And you Southerners can pour into Kansas. And we'll use the concept of popular sovereignty. And if you get enough pro-slavery people in there, Kansas can be a slave state. And Nebraska's too far north. So, I think we all agree Nebraska will be a free state. So that was essentially what the Kansas-Nebraska Act was going to do. It's on my next slide. And I have a picture of it in history class, but I'll also do this, because this is faster. I'll just pull it up. I pulled it up on Google too. All right, so there you can see it. Now, there were some people, Stephen Douglas, by the way, was a Democrat, and there was a very famous man who would become famous who was running against him for his Senate seat from Illinois, who wanted to be the senator from Illinois. And this man was saying, Stephen Douglas, you have made a deal with the devil. You shouldn't be allowing slavery to expand. You're making a deal with the devil, meaning the Southerners who want to expand slavery. And who was this man, by the way? Abraham Lincoln. This is going to be where Abraham Lincoln gets on the national stage. He's going to lose. He doesn't get the Senate seat. But people are really starting to pay attention to who Abraham Lincoln is because he's such a great speaker and he has such a good command of the law. And what Lincoln is saying is, and this is really going to be the heart and soul of this brand new political party that Lincoln is going to lead. What is the brand new political party that Lincoln's going to lead? It's going to be called the Republican Party. And it's going to form out of the ashes of what party? The Whigs. And what's the heart and soul and the motto of this new Republican Party? I just said it, but I didn't tell you I was saying it. We shouldn't allow slavery to expand. We can't take people's property away from them where they already have it, Lincoln would say. And in fact, Lincoln was saying that all the way up halfway through the war. We can't take away slavery where it already exists, because that's people's property, and the Constitution protects people's property. But we shouldn't allow slavery to expand. And look at Kansas. What do you guys notice is a possible problem with Kansas? Well, it's big, but, I mean, anything else? Yeah, it's right over the 3630 line, remember? We established the 3630 line in the Missouri Compromise, and it's over top of that. What?
They can't bother.
In theory, they shouldn't be allowed to go over it, right? Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Stephen Douglas had an answer to that criticism. He said, yes, we can go over the 3630 line because now we're not using that anymore. Now we're using popular sovereignty. So we're going to let the people of Kansas decide. He said popular sovereignty voids the 3630 line because we started using popular sovereignty in 1850 with the Compromise of 1850.
Who was Abraham Lincoln at this time?
Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer running for the Senate seat. And I don't know if he had any political office at that point.
What's the Mason and Dixon line?
The Mason-Dixon line is up here.
And what is it?
I don't really know what the origins of it are. I kind of need to look it up. It has to do more with this. I think it had a surveying origin. I can look it up. We can look it up to double check it. Okay. I mean, now it's people kind of think of it as a separation of North and South, but originally it had to do more with surveying. But I can't quite remember how it evolved. Okay, so what happened with Kansas? Well, Stephen Douglas got his Kansas-Nebraska Act. And if you want to email me, I will look it up for you if you want to remind me so that I don't forget before next time. So he got his Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas was established. And what ended up happening with Kansas is that you had Southerners, white Southerners, pour into Kansas so that there would be more of them when it was time to vote. But Northerners poured into Kansas too. Abolitionists poured into Kansas. Anti-slavery people poured into Kansas because they didn't want Kansas to be a slave state. And what ended up happening is that Kansas ended up being a bloodbath. with neighbor killing neighbor, 2 rival constitutions before it was over, 2 rival governments in place. We talk about bleeding Kansas because it was such a bloodbath. Really, civil war broke out in Kansas before it broke out in the rest of the country. We mentioned John Brown last time and his raid, which we're going to talk about in 59. But John Brown was an ardent, maybe crazy abolitionist. He went to Kansas during this time, and while he was there, he hacked to death 3 or 4 pro-slavery guys with a broadsaw. Just chopped them up. And he did that because they were pro-slavery, but none of them had any slaves. So that's the kind of violence that went on in Kansas. So it's kind of funny in a way, funny weird, because I think if we took a vote, we'd probably say popular sovereignty sounds like a good idea, let people vote. But the reality on the ground of it was that it was really violent and ugly and didn't work out very well. Now in the end, guys, Kansas ended up coming into, where are we? Kansas does end up coming into the country as a free state by the very, very end of it, but not before a lot of violence. And if you look at the numbers, about half of Kansas men fight for the Confederacy, and half of Kansas men fight for the Union. And violence about Kansas actually spills over onto the Senate floor, the United States Senate, a place where you would really expect people to behave themselves. In 1856, the senior senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, gave a long, angry speech about Kansas in which he accused Southerners of raping Kansas, and he made some very disparaging remarks about the senior senator from South Carolina, Andrew Butler. And Butler didn't hear the remarks, but his cousin, Preston Brooks, heard the comments. And Preston Brooks felt that his cousin's honor had been jeopardized. And remember, we talked about the importance of honor to white men last time. So a couple days later, Brooks marched onto the Senate floor and announced that he was going to punish Sumner for these remarks, and he started beating Sumner over the head with a cane. Sumner was an older man, and he fell down. He started bleeding. He was quite injured. People kind of were caught off guard, but when they realized what was going on, they pulled Brooks off of Sumner, and he was quite infirmed for quite a while. It was kind of shocking. But perhaps even more shocking is how people reacted after that. What did people do? Well, in the North, people in Massachusetts turned Sumner into a martyr who could never be beaten in elections again. You know, they kind of put him up on a pedestal. And in the South, were they embarrassed by Brooks, do you think? They loved it, and they started sending him more canes in the mail. The idea being, you know, go beat some more Yankees. So Kansas did not work out so well. We're going to skip over this slide on the Lecompton Constitution. This just has to do with the idea of there being 2 constitutions in Kansas. All right, the next thing is Dred Scott. That was the next major event that you need to know. And you guys have probably studied Dred Scott before, but it was in 1857 when a man who had been enslaved but had been taken to a free state by his owner, and then his owner had died and he was living as a free man. And then what happened to him next was then the descendants of his owner came back and said, we still own you. And so there was a court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court about whether he was really free or slave. And the Supreme Court came up with a 3-part decision against Dred Scott, but it was the most extreme pro-slavery decision you could ever imagine. It said that Dred Scott was a slave, therefore not a citizen, and he couldn't sue, that no black person was a citizen that had any rights that a white person needed to worry about, that he wasn't free, that your status derives from the state that you're from. Slavery is decided by the states. And the real kicker for what we're discussing today and last time is that Missouri Compromise, that 3630 line, was unconstitutional. It never should have been drawn because the Constitution protects my right to my property, and I can take my property wherever I want, north, south, east, or west of any line that the Constitution or that Congress would like to draw. Now, this was very, very extreme. For one thing, what did I just say the heart and soul of this new Republican Party is?
Stop the spread of
Don't let slavery expand from where it already is. And this is basically saying, sorry, you can't keep it from expanding because I can take my slaves wherever I want to. So did it make the Republican Party fold up their tents and go home? No, interestingly enough, it had just the opposite effect. Because remember, I keep mentioning this about Lincoln. When Lincoln said, look, this country will cease being half and half. It's going to be all one thing or all the other. Listen to me, people, Lincoln was saying. It's going to be all one thing, and it might be all slave. And now we have a big Supreme Court decision that's in their favor. So you should join us because we are working to keep slavery from expanding to the whole country. And now we've had this big Supreme Court decision that's against us. So you really need to join us if you care about this. So actually it made the Republican Party even stronger. Ironically, in spite of the fact that it undercut the heart and soul of this new Republican Party. Northerners were seeing a tilt towards the South. Now, Northerners were worried that the Supreme Court was tilting towards the South. How did Southerners feel? Southerners felt, well, this is good. You know, white Southerners felt this is good. It's a Supreme Court decision in our favor. But they looked at the North and they saw that they, in a way, weren't abiding by the decision because this new Republican Party was just getting stronger. They weren't folding up their tents and going home. And so white Southerners didn't just wipe their brow and say, okay, I guess we don't have anything to worry about. They continued to be worried. They continued to have secession conferences. They were talking at this time about pulling out of the country as a result of Dred Scott and the Northern reaction to Dred Scott. And then the following year, or I guess it was 2 years later, I should say, in 1859, there was John Brown's raid, which was hugely important as well.